Prepare yourself for a journey through war and adventure. Follow Fitzroy Maclean as he takes you to the guerrilla battlefields of Yugoslavia. These are his words. Let's begin. The weeks passed, and meanwhile, the supply problem was no nearer to a solution. We still relied on what could be dropped by an occasional aeroplane, flying haphazard from North Africa, while, for communications, we still depended on a rather shaky wireless link with Cairo. Our improvised landing strip at Glamouk was now ready, but, from the messages we received, the Royal Air Force seemed disinclined to risk one of their aircraft on it, and it was unlikely that the partisans would be able to hold, for much longer, the area in which it was situated. Then one day came the news that the Navy was considering my suggestion that supplies could be run across the Adriatic by fast naval craft and landed by night on the Dalmatian coast. They did not like the idea of running right inshore, but they thought that they might take their cargoes as far as the outlying islands, now in partisan hands, if we could find shipping to carry them from the islands to the coast and some means of carrying them inland from there. This was something. I climbed up the hill to talk things over with Tito in his castle. He greeted the news with enthusiasm. The partisans, he said, had captured a certain number of light craft at the time of the Italian collapse. These they had manned with crews from their Dalmatian brigade, the Dalmatians being born sailors, and had mounted with captured machine guns and 20mm breeders. In fact, he said, they were already well on their way to having their own navy and could easily undertake the task of transshipping any quantity of supplies and ferrying them across the E-boat-infested coastal waters to a point in Dalmatia where they could be landed. However, if such operations were to do any good, they must begin at once, for already the Germans were pushing down towards the coast with tanks, artillery, and air support, determined to reoccupy the territory which the Italian collapse had left unoccupied, and which the partisans were now holding as best they could against overwhelming odds. The port of Split had been recaptured by the enemy. Soon, the partisans would be cut off from the coast altogether, and then there would be no means of distributing supplies inland, even if they could be landed on the coast. When I got back to my headquarters, a fresh signal had arrived, asking for details of suitable landing places on the islands. Evidently, the Navy meant business. I answered at once, stressing the need for immediate action and suggesting the island of Korčula as the best place for landing supplies. I added that I would go to Korčula myself as soon as I could, taking a wireless set with me. This would enable me to give further particulars of landing facilities from the island itself when I reached it, and also to form an idea of the problems of onward transmission of any supplies that were landed. On the way to the coast, too, I should see new country and the partisans operating under new conditions. I decided to take Street, Henniker Major, and Sergeant Duncan with me. Preparations for the journey did not take long. The greater part of it would be on foot, and our kit accordingly had to be reduced to what we could carry on our backs. A partisan officer and 2 men were allotted to us as escort. We would be passed from one partisan band to another and would rely on them for rations. Our exact route was still uncertain and would depend on the future movements of 2 enemy columns, which at the moment were converging to cut the route down through Dalmatia to the coast. Parker and Alston were left in charge at Jage, and we set out. The first stage of our journey was accomplished, rather surprisingly, by train. During the counteroffensive, during which Jage had fallen into their hands, the partisans had managed to capture, intact, a railway engine and a number of trucks. Boasting among their number a professional engine driver and guard, as well as several ex-station masters, they lost no time in putting together a train, which operated clandestinely and somewhat sporadically up and down the short stretch of line between Jage and the neighboring village of Bugojno, which it had been decided would be a good jumping-off point for our journey to the coast. After years of weary tramping over the hills, the partisans were inordinately proud of their train, and Tito had placed his private coach, an imposing structure of planks with a stove in the middle, at my disposal, so that there could clearly be no question of our covering the first short lap of our journey by any other means without causing serious offense. Our departure from Jage was scheduled for the middle of the night, which would allow us time to reach our destination before dawn and the appearance of the first enemy reconnaissance planes. After we had eaten and got our packs and the wireless set ready for the road, we made our way across the river to the ruins of Jage railway station. The station was a depressing, evil-smelling place. It had been shelled and fought over repeatedly, and before the Germans had left the last time, a few weeks before, they had put several score of hostages into what was left of it and burnt it down with them inside. Now, the bustle of our departure lent its ruined buildings a certain rather misleading air of animation under the sickly glare and flicker of homemade carbide lamps. Our packs and the wireless set were put into one truck and then, after an interval, taken out and put into another. Some horses made an unexpected but welcome appearance, were entrained, detrained, and finally, with a good deal of cursing and shouting, entrained again. From time to time, the engine, which had had steam up from the outset and was belching flames, smoke, and sparks from furnace and funnel, emitted a cloud of steam and a piercing blast on the whistle. Then, after another long interval, 3 of the retired station masters appeared, complete with magnificent peaked caps liberally adorned with gold braid, flags, whistles, and all the paraphernalia of office. We shook hands with Velebit, who had come to see us off, and jumped into our private coach. A large number of people who happened to be going our way followed our example. The engine gave a final blast on the whistle, which was echoed by the chorus of station masters on the platform, and, with a great deal of puffing and blowing, we rattled and creaked out into the dingy grey dawn that was coming up over the treetops. From the door of our truck, I kept a lookout for aircraft in the lightening sky, but there were none to be seen. The next time we were engaged, we heard that a few days later the train, after an even less punctual start, had had an encounter with a particularly active Henschel, after which there had been a badly needed tightening up of the timetable. After all these elaborate preparations, our train journey lasted for little more than half an hour. Under a cold, penetrating drizzle, Bugojno station was bleak and cheerless. A score of prisoners were assembled there, shivering, their faces yellowish-white above their tattered grey-green uniforms. At first, I took them for Germans and reflected uneasily that they were probably on their way to be shot, the fate meted out by the partisans to all Germans captured by them, in retaliation for the execution and often torture of all partisan prisoners and of thousands of civilian hostages. On closer inspection, however, they proved to be domobranci, conscripts in the militia of the independent state of Croatia. These, the partisans regarded with good-natured toleration. They were, for the most part, miserable troops, very different from the Ustaše formations, which formed the elite of Pavelic's army, and generally took the first opportunity of deserting or letting themselves be taken prisoner. When they fell into their hands, the partisans either enrolled them in their own forces or else disarmed them and let them go back to their homes. A favorite partisan story is told of a partisan who, having disarmed a domobran, instructed him to go back to his unit and draw another rifle so that he might again be taken prisoner and thus once more contribute to the partisan supply of arms. At Bugojno, we found that we were having breakfast with Kojar Popovic, then in command of the partisan First Corps. We walked down the battered main street of Bugojno. Like every other town and village in Bosnia, it had been fought over a score of times in the past 2 years and was largely in ruins. On its poor bullet-scarred whitewashed walls, the inscriptions of the previous occupants, Mussolini ha sempre ragione, Ein Volk, ein Reich, ein Führer, had been crossed out and replaced in flaming red paint by the slogans of the partisans, Zivio Tito, Smart Fascist Move, Sloboda Naraju. If you looked carefully, you could see that the still earlier partisan inscriptions of a previous occupation had been painted out by the Germans when the village had changed hands before. We found Popovic living in a peasant's cottage on the outskirts of the village. It was my first meeting with a man of whom in the future I was to see a good deal and who was one of the outstanding figures of the partisan movement. I have seldom met anyone who gave a more vivid impression of mental and physical activity. He was of less than average height and sparely built, with a brown skin, twinkling eyes, and fine-drawn, hawk-like features. A fierce black moustache gave him a faintly piratical air. Though barely 30, he had the same tense, strained look as all the partisan leaders, a look that comes from long months of physical and mental stress. However, in his case, the life he had led seemed to have fined him down rather than worn him out. Vitality radiated from his leathery, drawn features. We sat down around a table in the fusty little room with an elaborately framed photograph of the owner's parents in their Sunday best on the whitewashed wall and a sad-looking plant in a pot. Sour milk was brought, along with black bread, a lump of bacon, and the usual flask of rakia. After the first few mouthfuls, my temper, tried by the vicissitudes of our grotesque railway journey, mellowed and gave way to a comfortable feeling of drowsiness and well-being. Popovic, I soon found, was excellent company. He had been educated in Switzerland and France, spoke French like a Frenchman, and a very witty Frenchman at that, and had a startlingly wide range of interests. The son of a well-known Serbian millionaire, he had at an early age become a convinced communist. His interests had, however, been primarily literary and intellectual rather than political. He had studied modern philosophy and had also gained a considerable reputation as a surrealist poet, and, in Belgrade society, as something of an eccentric, which, considering the limitations of Belgrade society, was perhaps hardly surprising. He had served his time in the pre-war Yugoslav army, but the science of warfare had first become a reality to him in Spain, where he had fought for the Republicans, an experience that had left a profound impression on him. After the Germans invaded his own country, he had been one of the first to raise a partisan band in Serbia and had soon shown himself to possess outstanding qualities as a military leader. Now, while innumerable flies buzzed on the dirty window panes, our conversation skipped lightly from one topic to another: infantry tactics, Karl Marx, the Atlantic Charter, and the latest French playwrights. I was sorry when an orderly came in to announce that it was time for us to start. I went away with rather clearer ideas on a number of subjects and the impression of having met a man who would have been bound to make his mark in life under almost any circumstances. Outside, we found our escort and 2 pack ponies laden with the wireless set and some of our kit. We said goodbye to Koja and started out. The drizzle of the early morning had cleared off, and it was now a sparkling autumn day. The track ran flat and straight before us across a little green plain, dotted with farmsteads and orchards, to the foot of the wooded range of hills that lay between us and Livno, a small town some 50 miles away in the direction of the coast. Beyond the hills, fighting was in progress. Livno, lay astride the road to the coast, had until recently, at any rate, been held by the enemy, as were most of the intervening villages. We would not know what route to follow until we had reached the other side of the hills and spied out the ground for ourselves. As we tramped beside the horses, I talked to Mitya, the officer in charge of our escort, a tall, smart-looking lad of about 21, wearing on his new suit of British battle dress the badges of a second lieutenant. He told me that when the Germans had invaded Yugoslavia, he had been a cadet at the Royal Military College. He had at once taken to the woods and joined Draza Mihailovic. Then, finding that the Chetniks were no longer seriously fighting the enemy, he had left them and gone over to the partisans. With them, he had had all the fighting he wanted. It was a story that we had heard often enough from former Chetniks. No doubt my present escort had been specially chosen to drum it into me once again. When we reached the foot of the hills, we left the track and followed more circuitous paths through the forests, climbing steeply most of the way. Once or twice, we saw German aircraft flying above us, and once, from the direction of the main road, came the roar of several heavy internal combustion engines. This, rightly or wrongly, was greeted by the partisans with shouts of Tenkovi. Tenkovi, tanks. Tanks. A point that we did not stop to investigate. Once we encountered a partisan patrol making their way in the opposite direction to ours, but with little idea of what was happening beyond the hills. One of them was a woman, a sturdy-looking girl who carried a rifle, pack, and a cluster of German stick grenades like the men. At midday, we rested for a few minutes and ate our rations. The partisans produced large crusts of black bread from their pockets, and we got out our water bottles. Farish had provided us, before we left, with pocket-sized hermetically sealed packets of the new American K ration, which none of us had ever seen before, and I was anxious to open one and find out what was inside. Each mysterious-looking brown packet, though only a few inches long, was labeled breakfast, lunch or supper, and, to our imaginations, whetted by plenty of fresh air and exercise on not very much food, conjured up visions of 3-course meals. Indeed, Vivian objected that it would be in the worst of bad taste to produce such luxurious fare in front of our less fortunate companions, who had nothing to eat but dry bread. However, our natural curiosity overcame these scruples, and we opened first one and then another of our packets. They were certainly very ingenious productions. They contained tiny cellophane packets of lemonade powder, specially primed with vitamin C, and tiny tinfoil packets of soup powder, specially primed with vitamin B, and a lump of special sugar, neatly wrapped in paper and containing, according to the label, a surprisingly high proportion of vitamin D. They also contained, all wrapped in cellophane, a piece of chewing gum and 2 cigarettes, 2 small water biscuits, 1 small bit of chocolate, and finally, 1 very small tin containing a mouthful of Spam or, as the case might be, cheese. The partisans, gnawing their bread, watched us pityingly as we fumbled with the cellophane and tried to mix the soup powder in our mugs. Before we had gotten anywhere at all, the cry of Naprid rang out, and we were off again. We were as hungry as ever, and we had also lost face. We regained it, however, at the next halt, when, during a general showing off of weapons, I produced my Colt automatic, another product of Liesland, which was fingered lovingly by the whole party and greeted with gasps of admiration. Finally, after several more hours of steady climbing and marching through thick woods, we emerged to find ourselves looking out over a wide sunny plain, with a road winding away in the distance. There were no signs of the enemy or, indeed, of the partisans. Then, as we were debating what to do next, we noticed a small German staff car climbing up the hill towards us. As it came closer, we saw that in it was a partisan officer, whom we all knew, Lola Rebar, the son of Dr. Ivan Rebar, who had been president of the Yugoslav Constituent Assembly of 1920 and now was a leading figure on the political side of the partisan movement. Young Rebar, who was still in his early 20s, had a distinguished fighting record and was regarded as possessing considerable all-round ability. Now, he was full of news of the battle. The partisans had succeeded in recapturing Livno and were fighting in Kupris, a smaller village lying between Livno and the point at which we now found ourselves. By the time we reached it, it would be in their hands. We piled into the car and drove off down the road at full speed, leaving our escort and the baggage train to follow at their leisure. After a few miles, we came to the smoking ruins of Kupris. Scattered corpses and burnt-out trucks testified to the defeat of the enemy. Partisan Brigade headquarters was established in one of the few surviving houses, overlooking the marketplace. Here we found the brigade commander discussing the disposal of the wounded with his medical officer, a formidable-looking woman partisan, who emphasized her points by thumping his table with her fist. As soon as this question had been settled, wine was brought in, we were approaching the vineyards of Dalmatia, along with scrambled eggs and bread, and we were told, at length, the story of the battle, in which the partisans had achieved a notable tactical success by the use of some captured enemy armored cars. The enemy, not realizing that the partisans possessed anything of the kind, had assumed that they were their own reinforcements arriving and had greeted them, literally, with open arms, a mistake for which they paid dearly. When we had finished our meal, we were taken to admire the armored cars, now safely camouflaged behind some haystacks. We waited at Kupris while our wireless operator, who had erected his aerial in the marketplace, tried in vain to make contact with Cairo. As so often happened, weather conditions or the neighboring hills intervened, and he tapped and twiddled unavailingly in the midst of a large and admiring crowd of partisans and villagers. It was late when we started for Livno, this time in a captured motorbus driven by a handsome young Italian dressed in a splendid white sheepskin coat. He was, it seemed, the pilot of an Italian aeroplane that had come over and bombed the partisans every day until one day someone had succeeded in shooting it down with a rifle. As he did not seem a very convinced fascist, and as they were very short of drivers, they had turned him on to driving a truck. This he did with tremendous gusto, maneuvering his clumsy vehicle as if it had been a dive bomber, and accompanying each flick of the wrist with a burst of grand opera delivered in a rich tenor. However, by now we were too tired to mind anything and nodded in our seats as we jolted over the uneven surface of the road and shot around hairpin bends. At midnight, a single lantern, only half illuminating the marketplace and masking the squalid debris of battle, gave Livno a romantic air. We were billeted above a shop in a room where holy pictures alternated with portraits of Hitler and Pavelic, which there had presumably been no time to remove. We were tired, and, having failed to obtain any food from a sour-looking landlady, fell asleep almost immediately. The next morning, we called on Milic, the local partisan commander, to make arrangements for our onward journey. The situation between Livno and the coast was obscure. Milic produced maps to illustrate the progress of the German pincer movement. The two claws seemed almost to have met. He hoped to have more detailed information the following day. Until this had been obtained, it would be foolish to try to get through. In any case, the journey to the coast and across to Korčula was not likely to be an easy one. Clearly, we should be lucky if we got away in 24 hours. Resignedly, we settled down to explore the town. Livno lay in the sunshine, a little cluster of white houses at the foot of a great rock cliff. From among them rose the dome and minarets of a mosque. Beyond the town, Livansko Polje, the great rolling plain to which it has given its name, spread away into the distance. On the outskirts of the town, earthworks had been thrown up, and the houses used as strong points had been battered and scarred in the recent fighting and in previous battles, for Livno had changed hands many times. Now, on the day after the battle, the shops were open again, displaying a rather fly-blown collection of German-made fancy goods for sale in exchange for hundreds of kunas, Pavelic's heavily inflated currency. We went into a watchmaker's to try and buy a strap for my wristwatch. The watchmaker greeted us with a brisk Heil Hitler and a Nazi salute, redeemed, on second thoughts, by a sudden convulsive clenching of the fist. Clearly he found the military situation rather hard to follow, but this did not worry him for long, and he was soon doing his best to sell us a monumental marble clock for which we could have no possible use. Next, We visited the waterworks and power station, stumbling upon them by mistake at the foot of the cliff behind the town, where a spring of water gushed suddenly from the face of the rock. The plant and the shed that housed it were undamaged and working away merrily, dispensing water and light indiscriminately to fascist and anti-fascist alike. As the engineer in charge, who had worked for both sides, explained to us, the Germans had not bothered to demolish the installation when they were driven out, because they knew they would be back soon and wanted to find it in working order when they returned. In this, they were disappointed, for some weeks later the retreating partisans blew it sky high. Livno was a notorious Ustasa stronghold, and we found the population surly and ill-disposed to both allies and partisans. Even the cajolery of Sergeant Duncan, generally infallible and backed with the offer of a golden sovereign, could not prevail on our landlady to provide us with food from her well-stocked larder. She remained aloof among the pictures of the Führer, the lace antimacassars, and the religious oleographs in her prim little parlor, preparing for herself and eating enormous meals, and twanging provocatively on a large shiny yellow mandolin decorated with a bunch of ribbons in the colors of the independent state of Croatia. Clearly, appeasement formed no part of her nature. Looking back, I suppose that her conduct was, in fact, heroic and dignified. At the time and on an empty stomach, I must confess that I found it extremely irritating, which is doubtless just what it was intended to be. Later, we discovered that, as soon as I left, she had sent a messenger to the nearest German commander, informing him of my movements. She was, at any rate, nothing if not consistent. We christened her the Little Ray of Sunshine. Having failed to get anything to eat at home, we turned to the partisans who, after a whispered discussion, at once made us members of their town major's mess. This functionary turned out, somewhat surprisingly, to be an elderly general of immense distinction of manner. His career had been consistent in one respect only: throughout his life, he had remained a regular officer, though not always in the same army. He had held his first commission in the forces of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, in which he had fought against the Serbs and the Italians in the First World War. After the defeat of Austria in 1918, he had joined the Royal Yugoslav Army, in which he had, during the 20 years between the wars, risen to be a general. On the dismemberment of Yugoslavia in 1941, he had thrown his lot in with Pavelic, who had made him a general in the Domobran. Then, on second thoughts, prompted perhaps once again by the course of events, he had gone over to the partisans, who, with commendable caution, while leaving him his rank of general, by which, I suspect, they were not unimpressed, had given him an appointment where his actions were unlikely to materially affect the course of hostilities. The general, he and I invariably addressed each other as Excellency, made a charming host. He was, he said, only sorry that he could not entertain us in a manner more worthy of such distinguished guests. His present establishment was a very squalid affair compared with the old days in Vienna before 1914. In his regiment, they had had silver plate and champagne every night. Even in Belgrade, between the wars, things had not been too bad. Now he missed all that. Indeed, there was much about partisan life that he actively disliked: sleeping out, or in bug-infested hovels, being constantly on the move, and the table manners of his brother officers. At the moment, he had another cross to bear. After his long and varied military career, he had retained strong feelings on, at any rate, one subject: he very much disliked the Italians. He had fought them on the Isonzo in 1917. He would have liked to have fought them over Fiume in 1921. They had come yapping and snapping into Yugoslavia at the heels of the Germans in 1941. They had, even from the point of view of the Domobran, been unsatisfactory to collaborate with. For an all too short period, after he first joined the partisans, he had once again had the pleasure of fighting them. Now they had capitulated, and some Italian units had actually joined the partisans. To his disgust, they were once again his allies. On top of everything else, an Italian colonel had now been quartered on him and was actually going to sit down to lunch with us. Here he is, the swine, he added as the smartest Italian officer imaginable, complete with varnished boots and rows of medals for valore, bowed his way into the room and introduced himself all around as Colonel V, commanding the Garibaldi Brigade. The meal that followed was highly diverting. The general and the colonel had no language in common, but this did not prevent them from wishing to communicate, or rather argue, with each other, and my services were soon enlisted as an interpreter. Battle by battle we refought, in Serb, Italian, and sometimes German, the Isonzo campaign of 1917, in which, it now appeared, the colonel had also taken part on what he called the Allied side, pointing proudly to the ribbon of the military cross, which nestled snugly next to that of the Iron Cross on his much-decorated chest. Soon mutual accusations of cowardice, treachery, and barbarity were flying freely back and forth, only partially mitigated in the process of translation. When we reached the present war, the fun became faster and more furious, for now the mess waiter, a gigantic, bewhiskered Serb who had been a partisan ever since 1941, plunged into the dispute feeling, no doubt, that he was able to put the partisan case rather better than his general. "Here, hold this," he would say, handing the dish of stew to his assistant, a fair-haired, well-built partisan girl, her shapely body straining the buttons of a very tight dark green captured German tunic, and the usual couple of hand grenades dangling from her belt. "Hold this, while I explain to the comrade general what really happened." Soon the discussion became general, more partisans came in and sat down, the stew went out of circulation altogether, and in the ensuing confusion, we managed to slip away. Dinner that night was a repetition of the midday meal, and by the next morning, I had come to the conclusion that if I stayed in that mess for much longer, I would have a nervous breakdown. Besides, it was imperative that I should reach the coast before it was too late. We went around to see Milic, only to be told that he was away on a reconnaissance. There was nothing for it but to wait another day. We walked out into the Livansko Polje and looked at some ancient white Turkish tombs, topped with stone turbans. We made a tour of the defenses and looked at the turf-covered bunkers in which the Germans and Ustaše had made their last stand. We were shown the place where a 12-year-old girl had dropped a hand grenade into the turret of a German tank, killing the crew to a man. We talked to innumerable citizens of Livno, some of whom liked the partisans, while some clearly preferred the Germans, and others frankly didn't care but wished that both sides would go away and leave them to earn their living in peace. I talked, too, at length with the Italian colonel. He was delighted at finding someone who could speak his own language, and to whom he could at last unburden himself freely, and I was also glad to have an opportunity of talking Italian again after so many years. His chief concern, I soon found, was to get himself and his men back to Italy, where their general, who evidently believed in leaving nothing to chance, had already preceded them in the first aeroplane he could find. The colonel made no attempt to disguise his horror of the partisans, or Bolshevici as he called them. They had, he said, been terrible enemies, and now he had no wish to fight for them, or indeed for anyone else, he simply wanted to go home. I asked him if he had come across the Chetniks of General Milovic. At this, he brightened. He said that, although the rank and file were sometimes undisciplined and gave trouble, he had always found the Chetnik leaders very civilized and easy to deal with. Indeed, one of the best parties he remembered since the beginning of the war had been given at his general's headquarters to celebrate the award of the Karađorđe Star by King Peter to Pop Dujic, one of Milovic's principal commanders in Dalmatia. What had made it all the more enjoyable, he added, was that this high decoration had been bestowed upon Dujic for gallantry in the face of the enemy, and there he was in person carousing at enemy headquarters. That, the colonel commented contemptuously, bursting with national pride, was the sort of thing that could only happen in the Balkans. When we got back to our billet, we found that a signal had come in over the wireless from Cairo. I had arranged that only urgent and important messages should be passed to me while I was on my way down to the coast, and so we looked at it with some interest. As we read it, our interest turned to amazement. The message was largely corrupt, but one sentence was quite clear. "King now in Cairo," it read, "will be dropped into you at first opportunity." It could only mean one thing. For some time, London had been concerned to effect a gradual rapprochement between King Peter and the partisans. As a first step, I knew, the king was to move to Cairo, where it was felt, for some reason, that he would be better placed than in London to know what was going on in his own country. I had been kept informed, step by step, of the progress of these deliberations. However, now, clearly, someone on a high level, Mr. Churchill perhaps, or possibly King Peter himself, had lost patience and decided to take the bull by the horns, and without more ado to precipitate the king headlong into the seething center of the Yugoslav cauldron. We were dumbfounded. The way had not been prepared at all. We had no means of telling how the partisans would receive the king. In my conversations with Tito, I had so far hardly touched on the extremely ticklish subject of the monarchy. My own guess was that if King Peter dropped without warning from a British aeroplane, the partisans would simply hand him back to me and ask me to get rid of him again, which under existing circumstances would be easier said than done. Our minds boggled at the thought of the embarrassing situations that might arise. My first thought was to get in touch with Cairo and find out what they really had in mind, but our wireless, temperamental as ever when most badly needed, now suddenly refused to emit a flicker. There was nothing for it but to wait and see. Meanwhile, Milic had returned from his reconnaissance, and we went around to see him. He looked tired and worried. Once again, the maps were brought out, and we traced the progress of the German pincer movement. It had been all too rapid. The two claws had now joined up, and the way to the coast was blocked. He himself had had a hard time getting back to his headquarters. It would, he said, be out of the question for us to attempt the journey. The last courier from the coast had only just managed to get through. I prepared for an argument. His last remark gave me the opening I wanted. If a courier could get through, I said, I could get through. He replied, with some justice, that it was not at all the same thing. The Germans were firmly established across our route, and the only way of reaching the coast was to get through their lines at night. If we were taken prisoner or killed, he would get into trouble. At this, I reminded him that my journey to the coast had been planned with Tito personally, and that future supplies for the partisans depended largely on my getting there. This seemed to shake him, and I followed up my advantage. In the end, he agreed that I should press on as far as Arzano, which the partisans were known to be still holding, and see for myself what arrangements I could make for my onward journey from there. I was convinced that we should get through somehow, and it seemed to me most important to maintain at all costs the principle of our freedom of movement. At the same time, even supposing that Milic had exaggerated the difficulties of the onward journey for our benefit, there was clearly a good chance of our running into an enemy patrol, in which case we should look very foolish if both Vivian and I were taken prisoner. I accordingly decided to send Vivian back to Javes with the bulk of the kit, and to go on to the coast myself, taking with me John Henniker Major and Duncan. We left Livno in the early afternoon. With us came the professor, a schoolmaster from Split with a remarkable talent for languages, whom I recruited at Livno and who was to be attached to one or the other part of my mission for the remainder of the war, covering immense distances on foot and enduring hazards and hardships most unusual in the career of a peace-loving man of letters. That concludes the 11th part of the story. Thank you very much for listening. Please subscribe for more episodes and leave a comment.